Good morning, everybody. My name is Elling Tjønneland. I'm a researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute here in Bergen. And we are now launching the third in our series of seminars on China as development actor in Africa. Today, we will focus on China's role as provider of development aid, development assistance to the continent. We often refer to China as one of the new emerging donors, and that is in a sense very incorrect. These days China celebrates 70 years as a provider of development aid. In Africa it began in the mid-1950s with a range of smaller projects, primary healthcare centers staffed by Chinese experts, agricultural demonstration centers and so on, and a few major infrastructure projects such as the railway between Tanzania and Zambia, the Tasara railway, built in the late 60s, early 70s. But something has happened over the last 10 to 15 years. Chinese development aid has expanded significantly in volume. And over the past 5 years, the Chinese development aid has averaged about, the aid budget has averaged about 50 billion Norwegian kroner a year, which implies that China is a large donor, bilateral donor in the world. It has, a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, it set up its own aid agency, which is not really an operational agency, but it's coordinating the development aid from China, which is implemented and managed by an array of government ministries, policy banks, provinces, and so on. And on top of this sits around small agencies with a staff of about 200 that supposed to coordinate and monitor these activities and help facilitate that it is an aid flow that gives results. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the rise of China also as a large aid donor is that China, this is comes in tandem with, is closely followed by or linked to China's expansion as a major global power. As a major economic actor in Africa, it's political influential actor, and it is in that context that China is important as a development aid donor on the continent. And today I have three experts with me that will help shed some light on different dimensions of China as an aid donor. With me in studio, I have Lomøy, who has spent a life working with in development aid. He's worked in Norad, been an ambassador to a Norwegian ambassador to Tanzania and to Zambia. He's been head of the Secretariat of the OECD Development Directorate, and most recently, he stepped down last year, he was the Director General of Norad. In Maputo in Mozambique, I have Sergio Chichava. He is now the director of an independent research think tank in Maputo, the Institute for Social and Economic Research. He has done much research and published extensively on different aspects of China's role in Mozambique. He's edited the main book on China and Mozambique, and he has published also much on China's role as provider of support and aid to the agricultural sector. And in Oslo, from his home office, we have Banik. He is a professor, a political scientist, professor at the Center for Development and Environment at the University of Oslo, and he has also worked on these issues for years. China's role in Africa, but also other countries such as India's role in Africa, and so on. And he has, above all, also is the provided the world with a series of podcasts on key development issues. So welcome to all three of you. I would like to start with you, Dan, and to hear your views about the China's role as provider of development aid. What sets China apart, if anything, from the development aid that we have come to know over the past few decades? Please, Dan.
Thank you, Elling. Thanks so much for this invitation. I wish I was there with you and you in person, but sadly I'm in my podcast studio in my attic in Oslo. I'm really delighted to be able to share some of these thoughts with you. As you've said, China is really not a new player. And in relation to your question, Elling, about how it distinguishes itself from others, I would refer to the preface of the newly published white paper on development cooperation that China has recently published. And in the very first sentence, it says the following, and I quote, "China is the largest developing country in the world," end quote. And I think that in many ways captures the essence of, if you can call it, the China model of development, about projecting humility. Unlike major world powers who claim to be good at certain things, it's almost like, the Norwegian mentality. We're not supposed to say that we're good at something. We're supposed to be modest. And I think China has distinguished itself, in my view, in relation to its development diplomacy. It has been extremely successful, I would say even more successful than any other country, by projecting this humbleness, by projecting the idea, however vague it sometimes is, about a future, a shared community, a global community and shared future, ecological civilization, win-win, harmony, non-interference, repaying kindness with kindness, solidarity. Its role, not just as the largest developing country, it also sometimes refers to itself as an important power. So I think these are, or a major power. That is what is the term that is used in the white paper. So I think there are certain ways in which the branding of the Chinese model is very different, I suppose, from many other countries. It also talks about this responsibility as part of the South. So just like India, China has been couching a lot of its activities under the umbrella of South-South cooperation, and has been making the right kind of moves, in the sense that it is appealing not just to developing countries, but also to developed countries, by talking about the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, while at the same time also promoting its major signature foreign policy initiative, the Belton Road Initiative, that has been in action since 2013, where it actually provides infrastructure, both training, technology, but also financing. And this is not just appealing to developing countries, but also to many European countries. So I think the way in which China has positioned itself as a trusted friend, an all-weather friend and partner to developing countries, making new inroads in not just Africa, but also in Latin America, consolidating bilateral relations, I think has been very crucial. And I would also say that I notice, I've just written a paper together with my colleague Benedicte Bull on the new form of multilateralism that China is pursuing in its development cooperation. As you know, there's been a considerable amount of focus on FOCAC and these regional bodies in Africa, but there've also been similar bodies in Latin America. And the way in which China has, since 2020, and we were looking at some of the reports, is positioning itself in many ways as, and has been doing for a long time, but this has been strengthened during the COVID period, is being the champion of global governance. It is championing, it is supporting UN institutions in terms of funding, and is positioning itself and showing how it differs from the US. So there's been this focus in recent years on China being the supporter of multilateralism, whereas many other countries are pursuing unilateralism. So all of this, I think, is extremely appealing. So just going back to my major point, I think the thing that we really need to understand is the success of this Chinese development diplomacy. It is about making people, African leaders, citizens, seen and heard. It is about promoting African agency. It is about giving leaders or expanding their economic policy space. It is about reaching out to countries that really want to do certain things that they've decided as part of their national development plans, but they don't seem to secure funding from it from traditional Western donors. And here, of course, I'm talking about infrastructure. And, I've had, as you mentioned, I have a podcast called In Pursuit of Development, and I've been speaking to a lot of really fascinating scholars, both young and also experienced scholars. And some of them have been highlighting how, and there's been considerable research on this, how China has invested in networks, in relationships. It is not just hard power, it is relational power. It is about all of these visits and exchanges and of course summits, which create a whole, a large number of people, both in Africa and Latin America, who've studied in China, who go back, who are part of a military establishment. They could be journalists, judges, politicians. And I think that kind of social capital is extremely important. And the way in which China and also India have been providing student scholarships and basically not really being as strict with their visas as European countries and the United States has been, makes people feel much more welcome. Now, all of this, of course, has also certain challenges in terms of, say, not everything is fine. And I see a shift in terms of perhaps becoming a bit more sophisticated than it has been so far. China has often had a very simple model. What is it that you want? What is it that I can offer? Let's make a deal. And one of the biggest challenges has been the lack of transparency, as you know, Elling. And this has led to a lot of rumors. This leads to a lot of myths. And you see this whole discourse, and we can talk about it later, in terms of debt trap diplomacy that Western powers talk about. But in reality, a lot of it is exaggerated. What we don't know often are the terms and the conditions, how these contracts are negotiated. And so there's a whole body of literature now that is emerging on how African negotiators can negotiate better deals. I think that is a crucial point. And I also think there are some other challenges I alluded to in terms of this China-US tension and how countries are having to position themselves and being friendly with both powers. In terms of South-South cooperation, there's China-India rivalry and competition. So there are all of these tensions. And there's also the challenge of economic slowdown in China. This was before COVID, and how that would impact investments. We don't see much of that. In fact, it's been pretty okay, I think, last year in terms of the trade. But as I was also maybe mentioning earlier about how China promotes environment, sustainable development, the SDGs, I think a challenge really is, and I'm coming to the end of my presentation, Elling, in case you're worried about time. I think a challenge has been inconsistency. That, on the one hand, China touts all of these principles of sustainable development, a green development, renewable energy, and at the same time, it can also fund coal-fired power plants. Some of the, rationale behind this is the Chinese who tell me, it's not we who decide. We don't interfere into what other people want. So if you want something, even if it is polluting, it is really your decision. And if we have the technology, we'll provide you with it. So it's this kind of inconsistency that also leads to some of these challenges, coupled with lack of transparency. And we see this in terms of the Lamu coal-fired power plant in Kenya, that has been temporarily stopped because of environmental protests. And mind you, there's another change in addition to what you mentioned, Elling, the Sitka. There has been this kind of growing awareness in China that one should do feasibility studies and impact evaluations that China hasn't been doing. But nonetheless, there is this inconsistency. My final point here, and I would say in many ways the punchline, is the fact that whenever there is this criticism of the Chinese model, especially in the US media, in Africa, in Europe, even in Asia, there's this feeling that, well, China is doing this and this is bad, and it is leading to bad governance, it is leading to more pollution, whatever. What isn't talked about, and this is something that I spoke recently with the former Minister of Public Works in Liberia, Jude Moore, and his argument is what I'd like to say here. What is the corresponding Western alternative to the Belton Road Initiative? There isn't one. So while there is a lot of criticism of China, and some of it is valid, there really isn't a Western alternative to infrastructure, which is what a lot of these countries really want. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Don, for sharing your thoughts with us. A lot of interesting pointers there that we would like to pursue in the discussion afterwards. But let's move to Maputo and to Sergio. And what is your take on this? What is China doing on the ground? Please, Sergio.
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you.
Yeah, but I think you can't see me. Let me just put the video. Yeah. Hello, Elling. Hello, Dan. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you once again to talk about China. And this time to talk about the Chinese presence in Mozambique. When I woke up today, I looked to the window from my kitchen, and I saw biggest bridge over Maputo Bay. This is the largest bridge funded by China in Africa until now. And it is helping the developing the Maputo city. And also it is helping the commerce between Mozambique and South Africa. So what I want to say with this is just upon your arrival in Maputo city, which is the capital of Mozambique, Chinese presence is noticeable everywhere. Today, China is the main bilateral creditor of Mozambique. And Mozambique, the debt Mozambique towards China is $2 billion, which is more or less 16% of the Mozambique total foreign debt. And most of this credit was directed to infrastructures. I'm talking about roads, I'm talking about bridges, I'm talking about ports, airports, and electricity. And as you know, many rural areas in Mozambique doesn't have electricity. And now many people, thanks to Chinese loans, they have electricity. Only a small part of this credit was used for the construction of public buildings and technological infrastructures. So I think this is not a bad thing. Where we know a Chinese proverb which says that if you want to prosper, first build roads. So I think the way that most of the credit was used in my point of view, is very positive, and we can see the effects, positive effects of Chinese presence in Mozambique. However, it's normal that there are concerns, and those concerns comes from civil society organization and political opposition political parties. For example, at the end of last year, some civil society organization and opposition political parties pressed the Mozambican government to explain the current situation of the Mozambican debt towards China. They presented many complaints. The first one was that Mozambique's debt to China was frightening and was not transparent. They said there is no satisfactory public information on the loans contracted to justify the size of the debt with China. So there is a lack of transparency and inconsistency. Also, they pointed out that Mozambique, if the debt was not repaid by the government, China will probably seek to confiscate some assets from Mozambique. Has it happened in some countries? I don't know if it's true, but they pointed out the case of Sri Lanka in 2018 and also the port of Mombasa in Kenya. And also they pointed out that the policy of China towards Mozambique will all increase its dependency. The Mozambican government responded. First, they explained that the majority of this debt was contracted to Chinese Exim Bank, and as I said, most of this debt was directed to for public infrastructures. I'm talking about roads and bridges and airports. So, and also the government denied that there were difficulties in the repayment of the debt. And also the government denied that the evidence that China would seek to confiscate some assets. The government said there are no indication, we have no can seize and assets in Mozambique due to defaults in debt payments. Also, the Chinese ambassador in Mozambique said Mozambique was not in debt trapped. So, and also they said those kind of complaints from political opposition parties and also from some civil society organization was something that comes from West, was something, was a propagandist rumors that comes from West. And that the infrastructure, the money used to build infrastructure in Mozambique was having positive effects. This is, I agree with this because we can see that today it's possible, for example, to travel from Mozambique to Tanzania thanks to one of the largest roads that was built that today is helping to increase commercial relation between Zimbabwe and Mozambique, and this road was built thanks to Chinese loans. So there are many exaggeration in some forums saying that Mozambique is in debt trap towards China, that the money contracted to China was not used in a good way or to invest in good areas. This is also, there are some complaints saying that Chinese aid is increasing corruption, not only in Mozambique, but in Africa. Personally, I don't agree with this assumption. I think this is the fault of African political elites. If this happened, it's not the fault of China, but it's the fault of African political elites who are not interested in developing their own countries, who are selfish, who are only interested to enrich themselves. Corruption happens in all kind of relation. It's not specific to China. And if it happens not because of the foreigners, but it's up to us to know what we want, how we want to develop our countries, which sectors we consider as important to develop our countries. So it's up to our political elites to use correctly the money that comes from China, not to the Chinese. I think if the money is used and it is invested in the right sectors, then it will have positive effects on local economies. There are some studies, I can't prove myself, but I saw some studies pointing out that some African leaders tend to use Chinese aid to promote development of their own regions. I can't say that about Mozambique. I think this is not happening. There were some complaints about transparency in some loans contracted towards China, but I can't, for example, I think this is not happening to Mozambique. Others say the African leaders are using Chinese loans to suffocate opposition political parties. Also, I think this is very exaggerated, and in the case of Mozambique, this is not the case. I think to the way Chinese aid is used in some African countries, particularly in Mozambique, as I said, invested where most of the money was invested in the infrastructure. We can say that this is helping in not only in Mozambique, but in many African countries, is helping to improve the lives of people, the lives of the most poorest people. For example, today, China, thanks to the Chinese loans, Mozambique is electrifying rural areas. So we have more people today with electricity thanks to Chinese loans. It's important to have electricity if you want to develop our own country. We also have people today with I'm talking about the poorest. We also have people today who, thanks to the Chinese loans, can access to the digital television at affordable prices. So I think the way China is engaging with Mozambique and the rest of Africa, from my point of view, is having positive effects. That said, China has like any other countries, has its own interest. Not everything is rose. There are things happening in the timber sector where we talk about illegal exploration of Mozambican timber. Most of this timber is exported to China. But if this happens, it's not because the Chinese are corrupt themselves. It's because it's the fault of our own political elite who, in collusion with some Chinese companies, are exploring illegally timber in Mozambique. The same happens in this fishery sector, where we have a lot of concern and a lot of criticism. But as I said, if corruption and illegalities occur, it's not because of China, it's our fault. And we need to know what we want in order to develop ourselves, in order to avoid this kind of bad experiences. So I can stop here. Thank you.
One small question, well, it's a big question, and that is because there's very little knowledge in the public domain, there's very little transparency from the Chinese side on how they spend their aid, the development aid funds. They have a huge aid budget, but are there any information from your side on how those aid funds are allocated in the case of Mozambique? Are much of the funds used to make loans more attractive, and that is to lower the interest rates, give longer grace periods, and so on? And how much is used for other purposes, such as training, education, scholarships for studies in China, and so on?
Sorry, this question is for me, or?
Yes, it was for you. Just a question. We can discuss it afterwards. But if you have some quick,
if you can,
quick response.
Can you come again, please?
Yes, you talked a lot about China's role in Mozambique and the extensive loans that China has been providing, and I was wondering about the role of the Chinese development aid funds, the aid budget in the case of Mozambique. Are these funds used to make the loans more attractive, to make the loans concessional, lower interest rates, and so on? Are the funds used to fund training, education within agriculture, scholarships in China, and so on? Or in other words, are there any hard information from the Mozambican side on how this Chinese aid budget is allocated in your country?
I don't know if but you're talking about transparency about the way the money is allocated. Is that
yes,
correct?
The aid money, yes.
Yeah, this is I think this is the main problem. That's why we have a lot of criticism because even this, there was a study published by one of the main civil society organizations published at the end of last year. One of the claims it was that it was almost impossible to know what was going on. It was almost impossible to access to the documents or information related to the Chinese aid to Mozambique. So it's very complicated to access to this information. And this lack of transparency is helping to fuel these rumors. But I think in one of my few contacts these last days, as you know, it's difficult now to have contacts because of the pandemic. I was talking with Chinese diplomats and asking them why they are not providing, or there is a lack of information about Chinese aid, Chinese presence in Mozambique. They said, I don't know if we can trust this, but they told me it's up to Mozambican government to give this information. But we are aware that most of the time, when we give this information, there will be a lot of criticism. People will always criticize. So I don't know if they prefer not to be open and be criticized, but I think that's the strategy that they are following. Even I have a very good relation with them, and most of the time they ask me information, but when it's me who ask information, it's very difficult to have information. So I think one of China needs to improve, even if China needs to improve its communication. And because the way things are done are not helping public perception, it takes people to think that something not transparent is happening because we don't have a lot of information about that. And also in some countries like Mozambique, for example, where usually there is the government communicates very, very little, or it's difficult to have public information. I think this Chinese attitude is not also helping at all. So to conclude, as I said, most of Chinese aid, particularly in the case of Mozambique, is directed to the infrastructure. As I said, 74% of this was directed to roads, bridges, ports, airports, and a very few to other sectors. So I think we can see the priorities of Mozambique government in its relation to China.
Thank you, Sergio. Let's now turn to Tjønneland, to the global side of things. What does China's role imply for the evolution of the, what we can term the global aid architecture, global aid policies? We've seen the rise and perhaps the fall of the global aid effectiveness, Western-dominated aid effectiveness. Debate, we've seen reduction in aid flows from major Western donor countries, and we have the COVID-19 crisis. And into this, we have also a changing donor landscape, China and also others. What's your take on this?
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. And I feel slightly humbled by being in a virtual room with so much China expertise, and I am not a China expert. So I know a little bit about international aid. So I'll tackle it from that angle and with that reservation also. And I think, first of all, I mean, the Western aid tradition, if we can call it that, which is codified through OECD DAC, has always been the largest, and it's used to be the dominating, but it's never been alone. The South cooperation has existed for almost as long as Western aid. There was a period when aid from the Soviet bloc was important and a sort of competitor in many African countries. We've seen with the growth of wealth in Arab countries, we've seen the development of a specific Arab aid architecture and aid system. And then, of course, we have the Chinese who claims to be, and of course, historically, to some extent, is part of the South-South cooperation tradition, but has also outgrown it and changed quite fundamentally in its character. And I think the Western aid architecture, if you put it that way, is of course faced with sort of how to deal with this. And one of the challenges is we're used to a vocabulary and a set of definitions. So now we talk about aid. Of course, in our system, that's got a certain definition. It consists of grants and it consists of elements of loans, but not all loans. And if loans are included, then they are included on some sort of net basis. Of course, a lot of what China does is not aid. And it was interesting to see that when China was reacting to the G20 debt relief initiative, it actually insisted that the loans from the Exim Bank and the China Development Bank were private loans, not public loans. So and therefore did not belong to the G20 debt relief realm. So, but it means that comparison of figures also become challenging. But since I've spent 6 years at the OECD, of course, I got used to sort of what you do with problems at the OECD, you throw figures at them, and figures are interesting. So if we take the assumption that Chinese aid is in the range of $6 billion per year. That seems to be sort of, so there's quite a bit of unclarity about what that includes, whether that includes loans on the sort of subsidized loans on the gross basis, which would make it not quite comparable. But even if we sort of put all that aside and say, okay, what does that makes China not a big donor, a medium-sized donor, half of UK and Germany roughly. So it's and much less than US. If you look at it on a sort of relationship to GDP, because it makes it slightly bigger than Norway, but then Norway's GDP is about $400 billion. Chinese GDP is about $14 trillion. So if compared to GDP, Chinese aid is small. In absolute size, it's a medium-sized donor. So what makes China big is its lending programs, and the fact that China has got state-organized long-term lending programs, which we used to have but don't have anymore. And I'll come back to that. Getting information. One of the areas one can get information about Chinese aid is actually by looking at the financing pattern of the multilateral system and then refer to this. And that's quite interesting because it actually shows that contrary to what one would politically expect, China has focused much more on the MDBs than on the UN system. So in the 19th IDA 19 replenishment, China was actually a sort of close, was number 11, I think, sort of almost on the top 10 donors with 3.7%, while Norway was 1.1. So in the IDA replenishment, China was 3 times as big as Norway. If you turn to UNDP, apart from the fact that China is a net, has got is a net recipient of aid from UNDP. The Chinese aid to UNDP is, I think, $29 million. The Norwegian is about 150. So Norway sort of massively outsizes China as a donor. You will see the same if you go to the World Food Programme. The one place where you do not see it is, interestingly enough, UNIDO, with the Chinese leadership, where China is 5 times as big as Norway as a donor. So where we see where we can follow Chinese figures, as in the multilateral system, we see that China is sort of focusing on the MDBs, and in the UN system is a fairly small financial contributor. How do we compare? And so comparison, there's one element of comparison which is about figures. The other one is, and the favorite pastime for us, I think, is to compare our ideals to Chinese practices. And then China counters by comparing their ideals to our practices. None of that is particularly fruitful. I think if you're going to compare reasonably, you have to compare our ideas to their ideas and our practices to their practices. And of course, then you can compare their ideas to their practices and our ideas to our practices also. And there's not a lot of that, but I think if you did that, of course, I think one net consequence would be that the differences would diminish substantively. That there are some substantive differences in ideas, and there are some substantive differences in practices, but not as gross as if you compare our ideas to their practices and vice versa. So how should and could the Western aid world respond to China? Of course, I just to a parenthesis, because I will have no opinions about China and Africa in a sense. I think, as our Mozambican colleague pointed to, that's something that the Africans are certainly best positioned to have an opinion of and make an assessment of and have a discourse about on the basis of African priorities. If you look at it from the perspective of the sort of the Western aid architecture, you could say that initially there was an attempt to try to integrate. And you mentioned the aid effectiveness in the road to Busan, the Busan aid effectiveness, the second big aid effectiveness conference. There was a serious attempt to try to integrate China into the Western dominated aid effectiveness discourse. That failed. And I think there's nothing that would indicate that it's become more likely to succeed at present. The other strategy is to cooperate, and we see there's quite a number of Western donors, including Norway, have established positions as aid counselors at their embassies in Beijing, with the objective of enhancing dialogue with the Chinese aid system. You see that there's been ample funding to research and to sort of arenas for dialogue, for sharing of experience. And that's of course that is interesting, because a lot of what China, as one of the disadvantages of getting old, a lot of what China is doing now, we've done before, but we stopped doing it. When I started in Norad, Norad was an organization dominated by engineers building infrastructure. That was Norad in the 70s and early 80s. And then Norad changed. And one of the important reasons for change was that we learned the bitter lesson that building infrastructure without looking at the capacity to maintain and operate those infrastructure investments left us with some legacies that we were not particularly proud of. And we see sort of China is of course also going through that lesson. And I don't know how the financing model for the maintenance and operation and maintenance of the Maputo Bridge looks like, but certainly that challenge is there somehow and will need to be dealt with. And we see that China is going through that reflection. Similarly, China now is very fond of inviting African students to China. When I started in this business, there was a huge colony of Tanzanian and other African students at the NTH in Trondheim. So we did the same thing. Then we stopped doing that and we started investing in building similar institutions at the University of Dar es Salaam and at the University of Zambia. So sort of the going from training in Norway to training in their own country. And loans are beautiful, but they have one tiny little disadvantage attached to them, and they need to be repaid with varying conditions and varying interest rates. And of course, we've been through one of the reasons why Western countries are not so fond of giving loans to developing countries is, of course, the debt crisis experience and the massive debt forgiveness that was necessary, because it turned out that we have lent money to countries that were not able to repay them. And time will show what happens to the Chinese credit, but we already see that challenge is evolving. So certainly there are lessons, there are experiences that could be shared and could be used constructively if one manages to create the space for cooperation. But, and then of course there is a but, and that's sort of the third alternative, which is competition. There's always been elements of competition it was evident in the area when there was a parallel Soviet bloc aid system, but it's also been the case. It's also been the case later on. And you could say that if the aid systems were left to their own, probably the cooperation model would dominate. But they are not. And of course, when Erik Solheim writes an article in Dagens Næringsliv about the importance of cooperation, of course that is important, but it's probably even more important that the new national security advisor to the new American president, before he took up his position, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs where he said that the area of cooperation with China is unceremoniously over. Mm. Of course, the unanswered and fascinating question that we're facing as we look forward, because how will aid react to and reflect a more competitive global order, where competition between the West and China will be there, and where competition about values will be an important part of that competition. And that, of course, leaves us with the unanswered question of how do we, in a more competitive world where the West is not dominating anymore, and that's, of course, that's the reality we live in already. How do we pursue our values? Because they don't disappear. Our belief in transparency is not, and our belief in transparency is there. Our belief in democracy is there, not only because we may believe that democracy is the best way of promoting development, but we believe in democracy as a value on its own. And how do we pursue those values in a more competitive environment? Thank you.
Thank you, Jon, and thank you to all three of you. We will now move into an informal discussions. Those of you following the debate on Zoom can also, of course, ask questions in the chat, and we will attempt to respond to them. Let me begin by asking a question to you, Dan. You highlighted that one of the key successes of China was its branding, its diplomacy, portraying itself as correctly, of course, as the largest developing country in the world, and that is the platform for its engagement with other developing countries, also in the sphere of development aid. But if we turn to what they are actually doing, are they China in their development aid relationship? Are they repeating all the mistakes of what the traditional Western donors did in the past, the engineering approach to infrastructure development, massive import of provision of scholarships and training opportunities in the home country, in China? Or is there something else to what China is doing that will ensure that it will become more sustainable and have a lasting impact? What's your take on that?
Thanks, Elling. That's a great question, and if I may, I'd like to also react to some of the other points that Yoon and Sergio have raised. But related to your question, it actually goes back to what Yoon was saying, that China is doing what the West did before. It is just that it is now backed by this huge economic muscle, and it is entirely correct to say that there isn't a consensus in relation to definitions, as Yoon was saying, that it really isn't about the OECD DAC definition. Everything, and this goes back to this branding issue, Elling, everything it does, aid and investments, are part and parcel of one China package, whether it's coming from state-owned industries, whether it is smaller private actors. Somehow the impression created is that if there is a Chinese actor involved, it must be the Chinese government. And I think distinguishing between the Chinese state from private actors, from local traders, is one of the big challenges. And in terms of the figures, since we've been discussing this a bit, as you know, in the latest white paper, the aid figures for the period 2013 to 2018, in that period, China talks about 270 billion RMB, which is around 41 billion USD. So which is what Yoon was alluding to. And there are three categories. It turns out 47%, this is what China is saying, 47% of that 41 billion USD was in grants. Now, I don't know whether that definition of grant is what Yoon would consider to be a grant.
Probably it is.
Yeah, okay. 48% of that 41 billion is in concessional loans, and the remainder, which is like 4 or 5%, is interest-free loans. So that is the three categories. And then the data from the Johns Hopkins University and the China Africa project there it shows that in terms of trade, it's been, you know, the last couple of years, 185, 192 billion USD. So it's this, for me, it isn't always clear what is aid and what is trade. So I think that kind of thing is there. And Elling, if I may also just, you know, allude to this fact, I think Sergio was saying the importance of communication, and I absolutely agree. I think there is definitely something there. There are language issues. There's often the problem that in Chinese embassies, there isn't too many, you know, there aren't too many people working on these issues. They just lack personnel. But there are all of these other ways in which we know what China is doing. One of the techniques I've adopted is using the speeches of Chinese ambassadors. Again, going back to your branding question, Elling, that's how, you know, they either boast or they justify their action, and they often use terms such as look at your, or formulations such as look at your capital 5 years ago and look at it now. You know, we've made visible, tangible infrastructure projects. You know, we've changed the landscape. And I think these speeches contain some, you know, information, very important information that we can put together. And in terms of, you know, one of the other issues that I think Sergio raised, I think is really important. There's a lot of misperceptions and myths about this issue of sovereignty. And a lot of those cases about Sri Lanka have been debunked. They are not correct. It isn't as if Sri Lanka has lost its sovereignty. Recently, there's been this issue in Nigeria regarding a contract, and there have been lawyers actually pointing out that those contracts are standard legal contracts. So it isn't as if it's a loss of sovereignty. There may be in the future, we don't know, but it isn't. It hasn't been proved as yet. What we know little about are the terms and conditions of these contracts, whether it be the railway project, the SGR project in Kenya, or a hydroelectric power plant, or whatever. Those create these rumors. But there are also African politicians. Mr. Sata in Zambia is a great example of somebody who built the idea that the Chinese were bad, and thereby managed to separate his political party from the then ruling party, came to power, and one of the first people he met was the Chinese ambassador. So, you know, that kind of legacy has also created tensions, I think, that we need to be aware of. And finally, in relation to corruption, I would say, I'm sorry I'm going on a little bit, but I thought Sergio and Yoon have raised many issues. I remember speaking to a Chinese ambassador in Africa at one point, and he said, you know, the West is really stupid because you should never give budget support. That's a sure way of getting people to mismanage funds. We just give little, but we make sure it is well spent. And so there is this, my final point, this is something that Yoon raised. I think there is a tendency I see that the Chinese want to learn from the West. And there are certain things that the West can learn from China when it comes to private sector investments. Even Norway, there's been so much talk about the private sector. One of the things that China has done is to push its private sector out, provide the incentives, and in many ways encourage them to invest in some of these countries. And before the COVID period, Elling, there was considerable talk in Beijing about trilateral collaboration. You know, China, another country in Africa, or in another, you know, in Latin America. And I think that'll be pretty interesting how that discourse goes on in the near future.
Thank you, Don. Yes, the issue of trilateral cooperation, I worked a bit on that myself, and that has been one sort of, from the West, one way of doing the cooperation with China in development aid, and it was interesting, and it's interesting to see how China has been is responding to that. They emphasize it in the white paper, where they highlight that trilateral cooperation, both with multilateral institutions and with bilateral donors, is important as a way to learn and share experiences. Although my impression, at least in the case of Africa, that very little has come out of it. It has led to a lot of bureaucracy and has made specific development aid projects very expensive, and very often we've ended up with the donor, in most cases it's DFID, and China doing their things, and the third party, the African country, is simply becoming de facto marginalized in the process. So it's a challenging, but it's interesting, and I would think that probably the best way to do it would be to work through international organizations rather than for individual countries to set up an X number of trilateral projects with China. But I'm struck by how eager China is on emphasizing this. And I've been to the SITCA, the aid agency, once in Beijing, and throughout my conversations, they emphasize strongly that I'm very keen on trilateral cooperation as a way of also building their own.
May I react very briefly to that, Elling?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think you raise a very important issue. I think it is a question of two very different systems. Can you imagine if when Yoon was the head of Norad, if he was asked, let's do something together, and the kind of checklist that Norad would have for all kinds of reports and studies, etc., and China would scratch their heads and say, this is just taking too long. We are impatient. Let's move along. So I think there is that, and I was mentioning this earlier, the simplistic, that model that China was following. What is it that you need? What is it that I can give? Let's do it, together. That is much more complex. And that's something that China realizes. And that's why they set up the SITCA, the aid agency. Unfortunately, the aid agency, as you mentioned in your introduction, is more of an, it doesn't really have much power. And so I think what would be pretty interesting in the future is how China adopts some of these Western methods, traditions, evaluations, and what it skips over. Because we have to remember that the Chinese perspective is very appealing because, number one, African governments, leaders say, this is what we want, and they're listening to us. They're listening to our needs. And that is important. And secondly, the urgency. We need to do it now. We can't wait. So we can't have all of these experts and reports done. We have to do it quickly. And that is something that China is very good at. So you're right that these are two very different models that may not find it easy to work together in a trilateral way.
Great. Let's turn to Sergio. Yes, please.
Yes, I would like to say some words. Globally, after all people spoke, just some aspects. It's not all rose, the Chinese presence in Africa. We know that. But is the West the example that Africa must follow? I think we need to ask those questions also. Regarding the democracy, the question of democracy, for example, I've never seen a Chinese politician in Mozambique backing our elections. They never said a word, but we know that our elections are not free and fair. But every time we have election, we have the West saying words, the West publishing reports about how elections are going, how democracy is working in Mozambique. So who is backing dictators in Africa? Is it China or is the West? I think we need to think about these kind of things when we talk about the issue of democracy, because there are, I've seen in the main forums saying that China is helping to helping dictators. I've seen such a thing. And also Mozambique today is in debt trap. And it's not with China, it's with the West. I think it was in 2014 or 2012, it was in 2012. Mozambique borrowed money in which is considered as one of the biggest scandal in Mozambique, and known as secret debt. Mozambique borrowed more than $2 billion to the Western Bank. And today we are in big crisis. And this is not related to China. So I think we need to be cautious when we're talking about, when we're raising this kind of issues. I want to emphasize and say again, there are many aspects in the relation between China and Africa that needs to be improved. But from my point of view, there are very important and positive outcomes from these relations. Today, for example, we have Mozambique, Africa has its first metro. I'm talking about Ethiopia, thanks to Chinese loans. We have one of the most modernized airports in Mozambique, which is important also for the local economy, thanks to the Chinese loans. So what I want to say is that we need to be cautious, and we know that today we are talking about Chinese presence in Africa, mostly because China changed the way that the West is perceiving or is looking to Africa. We need to recognize this aspect. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. There was a couple of questions in the chat. I was trying to read it, but I can't really see the text properly. But it revolves around values. China may be a country that does not intervene in domestic affairs of other countries. It stays out of that, and it looks at what it perceives to be key issues for development. But by doing that, they also sell their own experiences and lessons from their own country. And that may make it more difficult for us to, or for the West, or for Western countries that is concerned about issues around governance, corruption, and transparency and so on, to raise those issues in our dialogue with Africans and African governments. What is your take on that? I can begin by you, Lomøy. We have a specific questions to you there in the chat. Do you really believe that it's unfruitful to compare China's aid practice to Western ideals? If there were no Western ideals about democracy and good governance that we believe are superiors to alternative ideals, then are these really ideals we hold? I'm not sure if I quite understood it.
I think the point I was trying to make is that you must compare equals to equals. So if you read the Chinese white paper on aid, then you must compare that to the Norwegian or UK white paper on aid, the principles and policies. If you go out into the field and look at the practices of China, then you must compare that, as I think Sergio did, you must compare that to the practices of Western country, both as donors and through the financial markets and in other areas. So you compare equals to equals. That was my point. Of course, we come with our ideals, and of course we should not be shy about our ideas. China is not shy about its ideals either. When they talk proudly about how they have developed, about their development model, we should be proud and talk proudly about our development. We should, I think, when China talk about infrastructure, we should talk about the importance of human capital. We should talk about the fact that we've made a conscious political choice to move considerable shares of our aid budget from investments in infrastructure to investments in people. We should not be shy about that or be humble about that. I think we could be proud of that. And that is a priority. Of course, it's not. African countries will need investments in both human capital and in infrastructure. And of course, if you find a situation where you can get Chinese investments into infrastructure and Western investments into human capital, then an African country should pick and choose. And I think also to Sergio, I've certainly not been saying that Western countries are only doing good things, are not making mistakes, are not siding with wrong, are not siding with dictators. Certainly, politics and foreign policy and alliances has always been a part of aid. Less in Norway and the Nordic countries, more in American and UK and French aid policy, but it's been a presence in all countries. So I think my point was sort of, and we went through a period when sort of after the fall of the Soviet Union, when we thought that we could preach our ideals and we could say, if you don't follow our ideals, you don't get aid from us. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. So I think, so my challenge is just as much to us as Western donors. What are our ways of pursuing our ideals in a more competitive world? It's not about giving up the ideals, because I think we believe in democracy. And we actually believe that that promoting democracy is as important as reducing poverty, because it's a fundamental belief, and we have the right to hold that belief. We don't, and then we also must respect that African countries must choose their political systems and their way of living and find their priorities. But that doesn't mean that we don't pursue our ideals.
Thank you. Sergio, you raised your hand.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Yes, I don't want to take so much time on this issue of democracy, but I would like to just ask one question to John. It's John, right? What is democracy? Is there democracy for Africans and democracy for Westerners? This is very important, because most of the time, West come and tell us that we need to hold democratic elections, we need to be democratic, we need to respect human rights. But this, in reality, we know that is not working. Most of the time, if they don't like the government in place, they will do everything to overthrow this government. I'm talking about Mozambique experience. who observe, sorry?
You were breaking up, so can you repeat the last?
Yes, my internet connection is unstable. I don't know if you can hear me. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I was saying that we are holding elections in Mozambique since 1994. And civil society organization, respected civil society organization from Mozambique says election. Once, 2 years ago, I visited Finland, and I had a meeting with local diplomats, and they said Mozambique will only be well represented if Frelimo is in power. What does it mean? So I think we need to think a little bit about this and be cautious. What I'm saying is that I prefer which says we have your elections, whatever the outcomes, will work with the government. This is the way the Chinese work. I'm not adept of China, but I'm saying that it's not all rose, okay? But in fact, I see many positive aspects. Today, my father, who is poor, today can have digital television thanks to Chinese loans. We have many, as I said, public infrastructures that are improving our lives, are improving our economy, are changing the landscape in Mozambique, thanks to the Chinese loans, thanks to the Chinese aid. But we have been cooperating with the West for a very long time, and I've never seen such huge improvements in our public infrastructures in the last, more or less in the last 23 or 20 or 30 years. So that's, I would like to raise in order to think, to put us thinking a little bit more when we are talking about. I'm not saying that everything is good, everything is positive. There are many aspects that need to be improved, but I think also it's time to let Africa choose its own way. Today we have debt trapped. Mozambique is in debt trap. It's not with China. It's not with China. And this debt trap, this money was used for other things, not for the development of the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. Do you want to?
No, first of all, I am not against infrastructure. I think Norway had a proud history of investing in roads, in hydropower plants, and we focused on that because we have a rich experience in building. So my point was just that we also learned some lessons having done that, and that is that sort of 5 or 10 years later, if you don't, when you assess an investment in infrastructure, if you don't at the same time make an assessment of where is the revenue to operate and maintain that infrastructure going to come from, then you run into problems down the line. And that was our experience. And I said in the context that when I've been speaking to Chinese officials, I've sort of shared those experiences. This was what we learned. We did not learn that investing in infrastructure was wrong. We learned that investing in infrastructure was more demanding than we originally thought, because there were other issues that we also needed to take into the consideration. Then democracy. I believe in democracy, and I'm not shy about that, because I don't believe that I know how Mozambican democracy should evolve. That, of course, can only be clarified through a national political process in Mozambique. And I would agree that particularly during the sort of period when the West thought it was alone on the throne, on the global throne, there was a lot of easy sort of posturing from Western countries on political systems and on sort of how democracy should evolve, and a lot of easy solutions to complex problems. But the fact that I see that, but that doesn't take away my fundamental belief in democracy as a value. And of course, and I would continue to argue in favor of that. Then I would agree with you, Sergio, that simplistic coupling of that to aid flows is not a particularly good idea. But we should continue to argue for the values that we believe in.
Thank you. We are also approaching the end of the seminar, but one final question to all of you is the future of China's development aid to Africa. I think we all agree that China is making a difference, making a huge difference when it comes to infrastructure development in Africa. It is also brought other perspectives to the African continent. It has increased bargaining powers of African countries, which traditionally would only have to relate to the Western countries. But China is now also facing new challenges, which they haven't dealt with before, and that is about sustainability of their projects. They may not have paid sufficient attention to maintenance and operations of the things that I've built and constructed. So many indications of that when I recall it was the head of the Exim Bank and also the head of Sinosur, which insures Exim Bank zones in Africa, which after a visit to and inspecting the Addis Djibouti railway said that we cannot continue to fund things that are not sustainable. The costs are too high. And that brings up the issue of the so-called debt trap, the debt sustainability. China would have, like other multilateral lenders and Paris Club, bilateral Paris Club members, they have to deal with the situation that several African countries are not in a position to service the debts. So then what do they do? And then it's the COVID pandemic, which has also posed new challenges for China. So what, briefly, to each of you, let's begin with you, Dan. What's your take on the future of China and Africa?
Thank you. If I may, I'd like to comment before you answering that question on this democracy aspect. I feel that sometimes, you know, in the Western media, it is presented as an either-or issue. It isn't. In fact, most of the fieldwork I do in Southern Africa, and when I interact with policymakers, it is not like one model is going to replace the other. What it has given, what Chinese aid and investment initiatives have given is it has broadened the field. It has given more choice. And so we can definitely continue with a focus on democracy promotion, on accountability, investments in human capital, in health and education. It isn't as if one has to pick and choose. You can have both. And that is what I think is great. So what the West is doing, what Norway is doing, we can continue. But what Norway isn't doing, that gap is being filled by China and others. So I think that is that kind of coexistence perspective that we should be following rather than replacing one. But what does, Elling, in terms of the future, what does make the Chinese model appealing is the fact that China can say, listen, we have resolved the poverty issue. Okay, we've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. We've addressed the problem of hunger. These are things that are much more credible coming from another country in the South than if Norway came and said, yeah, we solved these issues 100 years ago. And I think it is there, the communication, it is the appeal of the message that I think is absolutely crucial. Now, whether that would lead to, I don't agree that China is promoting its own kind of ideology as much as saying that, listen, we've resolved these challenges. It's up to you now to do the same. Now, the good thing about democracy and civil and political rights is that it gives people, citizens, a chance to actually articulate their needs, their interests. Unlike in many countries of the world where China does operate, they listen only to the leaders. The Chinese are interacting with the leaders. Now, what happens sometimes is the leaders just, as I think Sergio was mentioning, the leaders may decide to have a project in their own backyard. It isn't something that the people need. So it would actually be good for the Chinese projects if there was an articulation of people's needs that leads to certain projects being chosen. The future, 2 words, sorry, how defaults will be addressed by China in the future, it's going to be important. And also the way in which Africa and many other regions can negotiate with China as a bloc to leverage their political support for Chinese policies is going to be crucial. Thank you.
Thank you. Any final words from you, Sergio?
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, just to, yes. Not one word, 3 words. One, regarding to democracy. I also believe in democracy. And I believe in all I've been reading about democracy. And I would like to see this in my country. I would like to see this in Africa, but not, and the democracy that I've been seeing in reality, I've been living in my country or in Africa, that is backed by West. First. Second, about the sustainability of what China has been funding in Africa. I believe in what you said, Elling, about Djibouti, but from my point of view and from my experience, I think China had been always cautious about what project must be funded. Taking the case of Mozambique, in 2004, Mozambique government asked to the Chinese Exim Bank money to build one of the largest dam in Africa called Mpandankua. Until now, Mozambique didn't receive money because the Chinese said, we think we will not be able to pay this. So until now, Mozambique is still trying to find money elsewhere in order to build this building. So I think from my experience, China had been cautious. I think it's not easy to evaluate everything, but China has been always cautious. The future, I think China will continue to be to play an important role in Africa, particularly in Mozambique. It will continue to grow. I think the pandemic, even if it's putting pressure on the world economy, but particularly in the poorest countries, which, for example, are having difficulties in paying their debts, it shows also a commitment towards poor countries. Mozambique now has been receiving a lot of support from China in order to deal with this pandemic. So to conclude, I can say relation will continue to improve. between China and Africa, and this will continue to change positively the way that the West engage with Africa. This is, for me, is the most important.
Thank you, Sergio. Any final brief remarks from you, Jan?
Perhaps three. One, and perhaps the board. I would fully agree that overall the arrival of China as a major partner has been positive for Africa because it's given African countries more choice, more alternatives, and given substantive investments to infrastructure. So then I think the arrival and operation of China represents important challenges to us as Western donors. I think one is on the question of effectiveness and speed. That I think Dan pointed to that as an area where sort of have our processes of assessing all the elements of sustainability become too cumbersome and therefore too slow. And I think secondly, the challenge of reflecting thoroughly on how we pursue our values, the way in which we communicate and pursue our values. And then I think there are real challenges to China, and there are, I think, at least three. One is the question of how to deal with the fact that some of these debts will not be repaid. So then how is China going to deal with that? The other one is the question of sustainability. I think again, the fact that some of these infrastructures will face operation and maintenance challenges. And then thirdly, the fact that projecting itself as a developing country will become impossible the moment China is the world's largest economy. And that is only a few years away from today.
Thank you for those final words, and thank you to also to Dan and to Sergio and to the participants out there. This brings this seminar to the end. We continue after Easter. Our two next seminars in the series will be first on, I think it's on the 7th of April, which will focus on China's relations with the African Union and multilateral diplomacy in a South-South context. And after that, we will explore China's role in fisheries off the coast of Africa. So stay tuned and zoom in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.